The colors on your website could pose a legal problem. Today on Expert Connections, we break down guidelines you may not know about, plus how to create a strong, sustainable sales team, especially in this uncertain hiring market. And we'll talk to a Michigan woman on a mission, creating businesses with refugees. Expert Connections starts now. When you think about making your business accessible, you probably think about brick and mortar, things like wheelchair ramps and bathrooms, but that's just the beginning. Welcome to Expert Connections. I'm Julie Holton. In this ever-evolving digital world, businesses must follow accessibility guidelines for virtual spaces. That means websites and, yes, even Zoom meetings. We put together a special panel for you, our legal and marketing connections expert. Joining me, John Mashney, an attorney at Foster Swift, Jesse Flores of Super Web Pros, Seth Getz of Symposia Labs, and Paul Schmidt of Uno Deuce Multimedia. Thanks to each of you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having us, Julie.
Guys, we know that accessibility is the right thing to do. It's also a legal requirement. So John, let's start with you. Can you give us a brief overview of what Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, what do businesses need to know?
So a number of years ago, the federal Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which for the most part meant that many buildings, sidewalks now are accessible to people with disabilities. However, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a movement to say that a business that has a web presence online, that web presence is considered a place of public accommodation, meaning it's open and available to the public. And now it is subject to the requirements that are in Title III of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's not been very much guidance from the Department of Justice, which administers that act, in terms of in terms of some guidance like, hey, how does a business create a website that can be accessible to people with disabilities? And so courts have really determined that, number one, websites are subject to the ADA, and courts actually disagree on the extent to which that applies. So for example, and some courts have said, if you have a website and a physical location, then your website is a place of public accommodation. And other courts have said, no, if you just have a website and your business is making goods or services for sale online, then you're subject to the restrictions or the obligations in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what does that mean? It means you have to make your place of public accommodation accessible to people with disabilities. And when we look at disabilities online, one of the main ones is people who are blind. They have to be able to access your website in a way where they can do it through the readers that they have. And the main guidelines that people follow, because there aren't very many, there's no guidance from the Department of Justice, are these web accessibility guidelines, sometimes called WCAG standards, and they're being updated all the time. So that's the current lay of the land. States are even passing laws that govern this as well, but the main thrust is the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And John, we know, of course, lawsuits make headlines and businesses pay attention to these lawsuits. The DOJ, as you mentioned, has taken action against some big names recently: H&R Block, Carnival Cruise Line, number of universities. Who is most at risk for legal action?
Yeah, I would think particularly anyone who has a website and a retail location absolutely has some exposure here, and they should absolutely be working with usually their developers, their marketing people, to make sure that their websites are accessible or at least meet these WCAG standards. That's the current, both the DOJ and also plaintiffs' lawyers that's the standard that they're going to want businesses to meet.
And of course, we saw a lot of businesses kind of rush this move to digital with the pandemic, trying to take their in-person services or products and offering them online. Jesse, let's talk about what website accessibility actually means. John mentioned we're talking especially about those with visual impairments, those who are blind. What are we talking about on a website?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as John said, really the idea is to remove barriers so that anyone can use the internet. And certainly, some sort of visual disability is probably the most common, but there are other kinds of physical and cognitive and auditory disabilities as well. And in some cases, you might even only be temporarily disabled. Imagine you break your arm, right? How do you interact with your keyboard if you can't use your arms? Or I didn't used to use glasses. So as we get older, right, our bodies change, and so some things that maybe used to be easy aren't as much. And so the idea of accessibility really is about making sure that anybody who comes to your site in whatever state they're in is able to access it and interact with that content. And unfortunately, for too long, that just hasn't been the norm. And a big part of it is that, one, some of the direction that John said, it's not really clear what all the guidance are, and they change a lot. But there is a bunch of legacy code out in the internet that is not built with this kind of idea in mind. And the remediation itself can be both time consuming and expensive.
Jesse, I think it's important to point out that some of these things you're talking about too, we're talking about color contrast, the fonts being used, things that, perhaps, color contrast, for example, if someone maybe is colorblind, what is your website going to look like to this person? It's not just simply blindness, as you were talking about as well. Jesse, why are so few websites accessible?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons why, and certainly couldn't name all of them. Some of it is the legacy code that I've described before. This was not something that a lot of people, when they kind of got online and started thinking about the internet 20 years ago, they weren't thinking about, these kinds of things, right? A big part of it too is that many people, when they build their websites, they're using pre-built themes, pre-built plugins that themselves might not have been coded with these standards, but they've got this functionality that I really like. I really want to be able to do this particular thing, like book this thing or whatever the thing is, right? And so you've got this cool idea, but that software wasn't built in a way that was accessible. And so one of the most important things that I tell our customers in terms of accessibility is you've got to start when you're redoing a site or you're building a new site. You've got to start strong, choose good software from the beginning, vet the themes, vet the plugins, and really start to make sure that from the beginning, you're thinking about this, at least going forward. And if you're starting a new project and you've got a lot of legacy code, because maybe it's not accessible, but it might be great for SEO, we've got to figure out ways to remediate some of that stuff as we get into it. But the reality is it can get expensive. The tools themselves can be kind of expensive, and really it's going to be kind of case by case basis until there are more standards that are more consistently enforced throughout the web.
So let's talk expense. Seth, just like we have the so-called green tax for sustainability, there is cost involved here. Are there affordable options, especially for small businesses, for accessibility?
Julie, as you're talking about, and you mentioned how making it accessible is the right thing to do. And John talked about how it's necessary from a legal perspective. I think it's fascinating how if you do it and do it right from a user experience perspective, it makes it better for everyone. A small example in the real world, but when they made ramps, the curbs into ramps, you know how much easier that makes it for me to take my kids for a bike ride? It's surprising, and it's a great thing. So it makes it better for everybody. So you look at this and say, if you design it right from the beginning, as Jesse was talking about, and do this with the user experience in mind. There's a steel case company over in Grand Rapids. A number of years ago, back in the 80s, they built a massive new world headquarters. It was a monument of a building. It was amazing. They poured millions of dollars into it, but they did not consider usability. And in 10 years, they deserted that building and sold it for pennies of a dollar because everyone hated to work in it. So I look at it and say, you've got to come at this thing from the perspective of the user experience. And to do that user experience, you've got to have someone look at it. We used to think of websites as being, you've got to make it beautiful and then code it. You've got to add an additional step in there now. You've got to make it beautiful, look at the user experience, and then code it accordingly. And there are getting to be tools out there that will help you to identify these different things. Tools that will look at it and say, here's the contrast that you have on these pages. It needs to be at this level. And when you make it better that way, it makes it better for everybody.
Paul, with so much business being done right now through video, how do we make sure to prioritize accessibility?
Well, actually, it's an interesting situation because it's a lot of the platforms are making it easier to at least provide the closed captioning at a basic level, almost automatically. YouTube, Facebook, all the social platforms are offering closed captioning as part of the whole process. Now, to really get accurate on it, there's other platforms you can use, such as Rev, or that can really dive deep into making sure everything is spelled and is accurate on your video, but you at least get a chance to start there. But the other aspect of accessibility I want to touch on, especially when we're talking about Rev, is ESL and people that do not use English as their main language. That's another accessibility feature that a lot of folks don't talk about, especially for those in populations that use a different language other than English. And so these platforms such as Rev offer that as well. And that's another huge accessibility functionality that spreads to different audiences. And then for the other accessibility function is audio descriptions. Now, Netflix is really big on this, and being able to have that situation for those who are sight impaired to be able to engage with your media from that situation. And as was brought up before, there are costs to this, because you're adding to video or creating another situation in which you have to create an accessible functionality for differing audiences. But as Seth mentioned, that means everybody gets to enjoy the media that you're producing and putting out there.
John, one last question. What steps can businesses take to prevent legal problems?
So first step is, if you're hiring someone to build a website for you or a web developer, make sure that built into that agreement is compliance with these WCAG standards, the most up-to-date version. And second is, if you do receive a letter from a plaintiff's attorney on behalf of someone with a disability, make sure you take it seriously. There are serious consequences, including paying all the attorney fees for the person with the disability. So make sure you take those seriously and you work with an attorney who has experience in those matters.
Thanks so much to all of our experts. We want to make sure you have access to additional resources. Head to expertconnections.tv and click the link for marketing or legal connections. Workers wanted everywhere you look right now. Businesses are hiring. Filling open positions is a top concern, and it's one that has many rethinking their recruitment and retention plans. Our Sales Connections expert, Shari Pash, joins us to talk about how to create a strong, sustainable sales team. Hi, Shari.
Hey, Julie, what a great topic for us to cover today, because all my clients, this is what we're working on. It's impacting everyone. So I'm excited.
It has a huge impact right now, Shari. Yeah. And the sales team really is our first impression of a company. So that relationship can make or break an organization. So talking about how to actually build and grow a strong team is important. Where do we start?
I like to describe it as success steps, basically. And the first one is kind of that path to success. We have to get our basics and have our foundation strong. Just like any foundation, to build up, you have to have it strong. Start with a job description and expectations. It's amazing how many do not have written job descriptions, but more importantly, written expectations, going beyond what we're describing the job to be, but what are the real expectations? And we also have to remember the compensation package, right? We have, there's a lot of things that can go into that, but we do need to make sure that's a part of the equation.
Absolutely. We can't expect employees to meet expectations if we're not even setting them or talking about them. Right. Okay, so talking about compensation, Shari, I get a lot of questions right now. Should we offer a sign-on bonus? What are you seeing in this market?
This is very common. I see many that are offering that sign-on bonus because talent is hard to find right now, as we all know. But I don't want you to get discouraged if you're maybe a smaller business and you're not able to offer that sign-on bonus. But if you can, definitely put it into your package. Otherwise, look at your commission and bonus structure and make sure that you are bonusing and commissioning on the behavior and outcomes you want from this new position. And if you can't do the sign-on bonus, this is where you can look at your benefits package, get very creative with paid time off. That's often an area that we can negotiate and be more flexible with, because the work still gets done. But if you've got a good team, that flexibility with time off is really important for them. And again, budget for these positions, right? Budget for mileage and cell phone and sales activity, not just your commission, your bonus, and your salary, because you don't want to come up short mid-year and not have the money for this position that you budgeted to start with.
Especially in such a competitive environment, I would think that these benefits are really, could be a make or break. One benefit that we hear a lot about, in part because of the pandemic, is the idea of working remotely or hybrid work. Is that a trend that you're seeing? Are people wanting more opportunities to work remotely?
They sure are. In fact, the clients I've worked with where we've interviewed candidates, the candidates have asked that question. Does this position offer flexibility? Would I have some hybrid work environment to come into where I can work in the office, but work from home as well? And we have found if managed in the right way and the right people are in the right seats in your positions, this works great and you get more productivity. So if you're able to offer that flexibility in how people work, that is critical for getting the best talent, because they are asking and demanding flexibility now. So that full package, basically. So that first step is get your foundation set, from compensation to benefits to job descriptions and expectations. And let's go from there.
Okay, so the only thing worse than unfilled positions is high turnover and having to fill those positions again. Shari, how do we measure for success so that we know that now that we have this foundation and the system we're starting to build for recruitment and retention, we need to know it's working. So how do we measure for this?
That's the thing. We want to think about, does that new staff person understand what success looks like for them in this new position? And do you understand what success looks like for this position? Because that's really critical, that we look at the measurements of success, and do we have that in place where we can see, are they making the impact with clients that we need? Are they making an impact with new sales that you need? And then we want to make sure that we're measuring that. Now that helps you sustain a good team when you have measurements in place, because with measurements, you can then train beyond. If they're not meeting those expectations, help them meet them by training them and such. And that's a key component as well. But they've got to be able to have those new member forecasts or new sales forecasts. We want to make sure they're on target with plans. Measurements are key that we include in what success looks like for a position, but they have to understand it. So that's really important.
Those measurements, I'm sure, are important, but also providing the tools and resources for how you're going to help them, hit those benchmarks that you're looking for. What kinds of tools should we be looking at?
I think to start with, you've got to do some training and when you onboard that position, because if you're doing a serious training schedule and they see what they'll learn, when they'll learn it, who's going to help them learn these pieces, it lets them know that you're serious about their success and they take it more seriously, opposed to just having them walk in, hand them a notebook, read this notebook, hit the road selling. We've got to be very intentional on our sales training and process, right? That's one of the strongest things we can do. Then from there, we've got to have tools for them, because now that may be a way for them to take ownership to help you create those tools if you don't have them already. So that's okay if you don't. But that's one of the things I love, is working with my clients on creating these tools.
What kinds of tools are we talking about here, Shari?
Right?
What's helpful?
I know, right? Not the hammer and screwdriver tool, but tools for those discovery worksheets where you can, what are the questions I need to know that are the priority, to help me learn the priorities and motivations of our customers and clients. We have to have these thought out, intentional discovery worksheet questions. We have to have benefit statements. How do we talk about and sell every product and service that we offer in our companies and in our nonprofits? We need to know, again, what are those managing objection questions? There's so many different tools based on the product or service you're doing, but it's really important that we have our analytics and we know where we're going with some of the tools for lead sources like that, client member ratings, all these different types of things I talk about. But those two are really key: discovery worksheet and benefit statements. And again, that's what we want to, because also you need these tools going into interviewing success even, right?
Absolutely. And Shari, I know that you have an article on your website that really gets a little bit deeper into the weeds on some of this. We also have talked about some of these items like managing objections in previous videos, previous segments here on Expert Connections. So all of this we can find on our webpage. For more from Shari, head to expertconnections.tv and click the link for Sales Connections. The job outlook is just one daunting aspect for refugees who arrive in Michigan. So imagine not only helping people onto their feet, but also passing it forward in our community. I'm joined by Sylvia Williams from She Leads Michigan with today's Heart and Soul Connections. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm so glad to have you here. It is important for us to be able to highlight organizations that are making a difference. Today, we're talking about a group with a big impact here and abroad.
It's such a great story, Julie. Refuge for Nations is a nonprofit committed to empowering refugee women in Michigan. And through strategic partnerships, they create employment opportunities for women who sew clothing, accessories, and baby products.
And like so many organizations, they made a big shift during COVID, putting their sewing talents to good use. We are delighted to welcome Cynthia Kahn, founder and CEO of Refuge for Nations. Cynthia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are a former teacher who immigrated to the United States. Tell us what led you to start Refuge for Nations.
Yes, so I have lived in 4 countries: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia for 10 years, Canada for 7 years, and then finally my final destination, the US. And since I have lived in 4 countries and I come from Southeast Asia, which is Pakistan, so I've seen the plight of women, that how they suffer and what kind of violence and abuse they go through, and a lot of atrocities that they go through. So that made me think that what can I do to help? Since I understand their culture, their mindset, the culturally relevant ways how we can help them. So that led me to start this sewing project. We started very small in Dearborn, Michigan, and then now we are taking it to other states also. But it has been very helpful for women because it covers their overall needs. It's not only just learning sewing, but also we give them a very comprehensive kind of help, which helps in all parts of their life.
That is great, Cynthia. How were you able to take that one little project and grow job training for refugee women by focusing on that one core skill?
Yeah. So what happened that when it was started in Dearborn at one of the very small locations, and these women started coming, so we would start teaching them. And then after some time, they would come and ask me if I could find a job for them. And knowing them very well, their background, their cultural limitations, their language barriers. So I thought, how can they work outside of this place, because they cannot join the regular workforce because of timings, because of language, and their husbands wouldn't allow them to go out for that long. So we came up with the idea to create a culturally relevant, safe environment and a workspace for them. And that's what we have created. So now they feel comfortable coming there. We teach them sewing skills. Many volunteers come to help out. And this is run mostly by volunteers. So it's a nonprofit organization. So everything that we do is for the women, to help them out and to create jobs for them. And during COVID, as you mentioned, during COVID, it was wonderful because they could actually use their skill, because at that time everybody was looking for industrial sewers because there was a huge need for making masks and gowns for hospitals and all the medical staff. So I think our skill, that our skilled women, they were immediately employed, and we worked with a big organization in Detroit who had a big project from DMC to make 100,000 gowns, disposable gowns. And we partnered with them. So all our women stayed employed throughout this time. And this was such a wonderful, I believe, arrangement and a help that by God's grace we provided to these women, because their husbands were unemployed at that time. So they became the breadwinners of the family at that time. And that was...
Wow.
Yeah, that is great.
Cynthia, what an inspiring story, especially during this time with the pandemic. As you mentioned, to be able to also give back into the community. Thank you so much for joining us today to share your story. To hear more from the women of She Leads Michigan, head to our website. You'll find us at expertconnections.tv. Just click Heart and Soul Connections. Could your mindset be the key to unlocking the door to financial success? Yes, says Joyce Marter, a licensed psychotherapist and entrepreneur who built and sold a multi-million-dollar company, and now author of The Financial Mindset Fix.
In my practice, I noticed that as my clients started to make progress in therapy, they started to earn more money. I realized this was because their self-worth was improving, and it changed how they put themselves out in the world with greater confidence, more courage, expanding their comfort zone, welcoming a greater vision, and welcoming greater prosperity. I became very interested in how our thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and relationship with money shape our financial reality. In my entrepreneurial journey, I made 1,000 mistakes. And at one point, I thought I was going to have to file business bankruptcy. I experienced tremendous financial anxiety. And then I used tools from psychology to turn the ship around. My book is based on 12 mindsets that are empirically proven to improve both mental health and financial health. It's a program with exercises and practical tools and strategies to help you build these skills and transform your life.
We've created a link for you on our website. If you'd like to learn more, head to expertconnections.tv and click the link for Community Connections. Thank you for joining us for Expert Connections. I'm Julie Holton. We'll see you back here next Monday.
Expert Connections is executive produced by M Connections Marketing Agency in collaboration with Foster Swift Law Firm. Strategic Solutions for Growth. Super Web Pros, Symposium Labs, Uno Deuce Multimedia, and She Leads Michigan. A special thank you to our Style Connections partners, Polka Dots Boutique, The Standard Spa, and Beauty by Wilder. Visit our Style Spotlight online at WLAJ.com/Expert Connections.